Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the lecture on COVID-19 and racism. This is part two. And in part two, we're going to move on to discussing how the acts of anti-Asian racism that we covered in part one are not new phenomena. Rather, what we're seeing right now is an extension of a long history of Asian exclusion in North America. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the Canadian state enacted policies that specifically were designed to preserve the dominance of Anglo-European populations and identity to the exclusion of racial minorities, particularly the Chinese. And this includes implementing the Chinese Immigration Act in 1885, otherwise known as the head tax, which required Chinese immigrants to pay an entry fee in order to be admitted to Canada. Immigrants from other countries of origin, however, were not required to pay such a tax. And on July 1st, 1923, the head tax was abolished and replaced by the Chinese Immigration Act, which completely banned all further Chinese immigration, with the exception of a few small categories. And this act was in place for 24 years until it was finally repealed in 1947. Now, what does this have to do with anti-Asian sentiment today? Well, anti-Asian immigration policies, what they do is that they stigmatize Asian immigrants and prevent them from being able to participate fully in public life in their host countries. At the time, Chinese minorities were treated not as multifaceted human beings, but simply as cheap, disposable labor, and therefore were not allowed to vote, not allowed to practice law or medicine, hold public office, find employment in public works, own crown land, among other restrictions that negatively impacted their political, social, and economic integration and well-being. And it's important to note that laws don't just reflect social policies, social and political attitudes, but they also actively shape them. What they do is they signal to society what is just and what is not, and who belongs and who does not. And what anti-Asian policies in the late 19th and early 20th century did were reinforce the idea that Chinese immigrants were unfit to be a permanent part of the Canadian nation. Now, here's an illustration published in April 1879 by the Canadian Illustrated News called The Heathen Chinese in British Columbia, which depicts BC Premier at the time, Amour de Cosmos, kicking a Chinese immigrant out of BC. And the caption partially reads, and I'm omitting the racist remarks, the more racist remarks, that is, because you can't and won't assimilate with us. You won't drink whiskey and talk politics and vote like us. So this idea that Chinese immigrants refuse to embrace the social and cultural values of Canadian society fails to acknowledge an important actor in historical Canadian race relations, and that is the Canadian state, which actively deterred Chinese immigration and integration. Now, unfortunately, due to time constraints, we can't go too much deeper into this history, but if you're interested in exploring these topics in greater depth, we'll be discussing them in my Sociology of Migration, SOCI 303 course next spring, which you're very much welcome to take. The main point that I want to make here, though, is that early discourses against Asian immigrants didn't just take issue with their supposed cultural and moral deficiencies or distinctiveness, but they also stoked fear and panic specifically about the epidemiological threats that they supposedly posed to Canadian populations. So just as today, how politicians are pushing a xenophobic rhetoric of COVID-19 as the Chinese virus, in the late 19th and early 20th century in British Columbia, anti-immigrant actors dubbed leprosy as the Chinese disease. Sounds familiar, right? And this is what Professor Renisa Mawani in the sociology department at UBC writes about in her 2003 article, which is linked at the end of this PowerPoint presentation. Chinese immigrants coming to Canada to provide their labor were constructed by Canadian politicians as unsanitary, dirty, and as carriers of disease, including syphilis, smallpox, and leprosy. Infectious diseases, therefore, became racialized. They became inseparable from the specific racialized bodies. Chinese people, therefore, were not just culturally backwards or morally uncouth or unassimilable, but their very physical bodies were also accused of having the potential to contaminate the white Canadian population with disease. And these discourses served to justify the government's efforts to contain and control the Chinese community in British Columbia at the time. For example, by forcibly detaining Chinese immigrants who had leprosy on the small island of Darcy off of the coast of Vancouver Island and effectively left to die. And more importantly, to limit the immigration flows from China to Canada entirely. And similar sentiments were circulating in the United States. So let's take a look at some examples of how these discourses were constructed. In 1879, US Senator James Blaine wrote, "If, as a nation, we have the right to keep out infectious diseases, if we have the right to exclude the criminal classes from coming to us, we surely have the right to exclude that immigration which reeks with impurity and which cannot come to us without plenteously sowing the seeds of moral and physical disease, destitution, and death." And this quote again shows how immigrant bodies became conflated with the threat of disease and sickness in order to justify their exclusion from the US territory in this case. And in Victoria, BC, today, you can still find this plaque, which reads, "Between 1891 and 1906, these men died on this island, victims of leprosy and prejudice. May the symbol of remembrance restore them to humanity." Now, that's the end of part 2, and we will come back and briefly conclude with part 3.